the East River, New York. The 1st of December, 1870. A wooden caisson had been sunk to serve as a deep foundation for a new bridge from Manhattan to Brooklyn. Inside it, workmen laboured late into the night. Suddenly, a small fire in the roof exploded.
And then all above is this mass of living coals.
They tried to put out the flames, but their buckets of water were useless.
Like an animal, they're feeding this ravening beast with water, and nothing is subduing it. It could not be put out. They were sending hoses of water up into the roof of the caisson. They were blowing steam in there, and still every time water would pour out, they would look up and check. The roof would still be burning.
The chief engineer was Washington Roebling, 33 years old, and he was largely dealing with this on his own. Roebling's assistants deliberately tried to live at least 3 miles away from the site, so they were not on hand in case of an emergency just like this.
He'd been in there for 7 hours, trying to figure out this problem.
The fate of the whole structure lay in his hands.
He's there, looking at the fire. Everything is a mess. People don't know what to do. They're afraid that the caisson is going to collapse. All these considerations had to be carefully weighed. The whole work rests on these caissons. If these caissons do not succeed, the bridge is going to be a failure.
And for Roebling, this wasn't his only worry. He was feeling something strange, which he described as
that peculiar numb feeling in the small of the back and lower limbs, which precedes paralysis.
For BBC Radio 4, this is History's Heroes. People with purpose, brave ideas, and the courage to stand alone. I'm Alex von Tunzelmann, I'm a historian, and today's episode is about Washington and Emily Roebling. They were a 19th century power couple who worked on the building of the Brooklyn Bridge. In the face of seemingly impossible engineering challenges, and even more extreme physical challenges, these two extraordinary people just kept going to build one of the greatest 19th century symbols of American industrial progress.
There's a Tumblr site, My 19th Century Boyfriend, which has hot young guys of the past. And he definitely, I think belongs on there.
Erica Wagner has long been fascinated by Washington Roebling, the chief engineer of the Brooklyn Bridge.
His full name is Washington Augustus Roebling. And by coincidence, if we like to think of it that way, my full name is Erica Augusta Wagner.
She was struck by the magnificence of the Brooklyn Bridge while walking over it.
The pedestrian walkway is over the traffic. You are superior to the traffic. And you see the interlaced, smaller steel cables, the vertical suspenders, and then the diagonal cables that make that famous spider web.
A walk across comes with a view of the Statue of Liberty to the south and the East River below.
The entrance to the bridge is different, depending on whether you walk over it from Brooklyn or from Manhattan. And when you walk from Brooklyn, as you start to walk over the river, every aspect of the bridge and the city changes. You see the four great cables rising up towards the towers. Those great Gothic towers come closer and closer to you. And as you walk, you can see the scale of them. And you can begin to understand what it might have been like in 1883, when no one had ever seen anything that tall.
But building the bridge appeared from the beginning to be an almost impossible technical challenge. 1867. The New York Bridge Company hired a Prussian-American engineer, John A. Roebling.
A great and important man, the builder of this wire rope industry, the designer of some of the great early suspension bridges.
Roebling's wire ropes were a stronger alternative to hemp rope in transport, haulage, and even bridge building. In Pittsburgh, Roebling built a wooden aqueduct to carry Pennsylvania's main east-west canal above and across the Allegheny River. Later, he built his first wire suspension bridge. Suspension bridges were still a recent innovation, but in the mid-19th century, the United States was rapidly undergoing industrialization. New York and Brooklyn were both growing fast, but there was no reliable transport between the two.
Before there were any bridges over the East River, you had to cross by ferries. And the ferries were unreliable, and if the river froze, which it often did in those days, you couldn't get from New York to Brooklyn.
John Roebling was appointed chief engineer of what was then called the East River Bridge. It was his job to design and oversee the construction of what the company hoped would be the longest suspension bridge in the world and the first ever to use steel cables. But John Roebling was never an easy man to live with.
A fearsome tyrant as a parent.
Still, his son Washington Roebling worked hard as his apprentice.
When he was a kid, he worked with his father on a railroad bridge that his father built over Niagara Falls.
Washington was handsome and quite unassuming.
Fairly tall, at the time. He had a broad face, wide-set eyes. He attended a school called Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, one of the first great technical colleges in the world.
Washington came of age a couple of years before the American Civil War.
It was a war fought over the evil of chattel slavery.
He joined the Union Army, fighting for the North against the slaveholding southern states of the Confederacy. He fought bravely at the Battle of Gettysburg, the turning point of the war. He was promoted to the rank of colonel. As well as that distinction, the war brought him a wife. At a military ball, he met Emily Warren.
She had dark, quite curly hair. She had dark eyes.
Washington Roebling was a quiet man. Emily Warren was forthright. From the start, they adored each other.
He said that her beauty was kind of all in her liveliness and all in her movement. There are wonderful epithets in his letters to her. He calls her things like my broad-hipped beauty.
The war ended with a Union victory in 1865. Washington Roebling returned to civil engineering, working again with his father. The young married couple went to Europe to help plan the East River Bridge.
It was a research trip both to talk to manufacturers, other wire manufacturers, particularly in England, to see what their techniques were, to think about the new technology of the caisson.
By then, Emily Roebling was pregnant. Still, she insisted on going with her husband. On the Atlantic crossing, she was violently sick and had a bad fall. While they were visiting John Roebling's hometown in Prussia, she went into labour.
She ended up giving birth to their son, John, but the birth was very, very difficult. She lost a lot of blood. She nearly died.
The Roeblings and their new son returned to New York. But in the summer of 1869, Washington's father, John, was on the shore of the East River when he had a horrific accident.
He was standing on some pilings in the river, waiting for a ferry to come in. And he didn't realize that his boot was stuck between two of the wooden pilings, and when the ferry came in, was crushed.
His toes had to be amputated. After that, though, he refused further medical treatment.
He really was a kind of health crank. He believed exclusively in the water cure. Anything that ailed you, if you poured freezing water over yourself, that would do the trick.
It didn't do the trick. John Roebling became feverish.
Dying of tetanus is not a good way to die.
Washington Roebling watched in horror as his father writhed in pain and died at the age of 63. Just weeks after his father's death, Washington Roebling had to make a choice. He'd hoped to have an easier life in New York now he was a husband and father, But now his own father was gone, and there was no one to oversee the East River Bridge.
John Roebling had made only the most basic plans, the most basic schemes. Really, work had hardly begun. He really was the only man alive who could have taken this work over.
It was a huge responsibility.
Everything that had to be done, how the bridge would actually be brought to fruition, that was all down to Washington.
He didn't even know for sure that it would be possible to finish the bridge. He was tempted to give in to his fears and leave the project behind. But Washington Roebling had already shown himself to be a man of courage and duty during the Civil War, and now he had his father's legacy to protect. He accepted the job of chief engineer. May 1870. On the Brooklyn side of the East River, Washington Roebling climbed through the airlock of a caisson.
It's a French word. It means chest, a kind of upside-down box. Huge, the size of the bottom of one of the towers. These radical new methods of construction, they were made of wood, like upside-down wooden ships.
The caissons were innovative technology.
No bridge of this scale and size had ever been built, and it was built using techniques that were really in a very experimental stage. This was a completely radical, novel construction. Nothing like this had ever been built, and a lot of people didn't think it could be built.
The caissons were towed into place, then planted on the riverbed. Workmen could go inside via an airlock to excavate foundations for the bridge's towers.
They are digging down, hopefully to bedrock, so that the towers can rest on a firm foundation.
They used shovels to dig deep under the water.
The caisson gradually sinks and sinks and sinks. So they're clearing out the ground underneath. The stones of the towers are being piled on top, and that's how the towers grow.
Washington Roebling supervised hundreds of men, often directly.
Washington was down in those caissons, hour after hour, day after day, week after week.
The caissons contained compressed air. The atmosphere inside them was pressurized and rich in oxygen.
And obviously, the men are using candles to see by.
Washington Roebling knew that fire posed a huge risk. After several small incidents, fire extinguishers were put in place. The work in the Brooklyn caissons trundled on. On the 1st of December 1870, the night the major fire broke out, workmen were digging as usual in the grim conditions of the caisson.
The filth, the darkness. There weren't really toilets or anything. So what exactly, like the mud of the floor, would have been made from? We don't really like to think.
That night, a workman left through the airlock. By accident, he left a candle burning in the roof space.
Probably in a little box where he kept his lunch, to burn invisibly, because down in the caisson, the air is too dense for flame.
A small fire spread. Washington Roebling was supervising when flames engulfed the caisson.
The only chance of saving this structure and saving the bridge would be to pour well over 1 million gallons of water into the caisson for hours and hours to flood it.
There was no guarantee that even that would work.
They don't know if the caisson will stay upright when it's not full of compressed air.
Washington Roebling sent the workers back up to the surface.
So they call all these boats and they just pour water and they pour water into the caisson until it fills up to the top. 1,350,000 gallons of water.
Astonishingly, it worked. The bridge was saved, for now. The Brooklyn caisson was pumped out and repaired. Months later, another caisson was towed into place, this time on the Manhattan side. Meanwhile, Washington Roebling's health took a turn for the worse.
Terrible pains in his bones and his jaw.
At home, life was hard. Since his son John's birth, doctors had warned about the dangers of Emily getting pregnant again.
It's striking to consider what that would have meant for a couple who loved each other and were clearly very strongly attracted to each other in the days before reliable birth control. A further weight on their marriage.
By early 1871, Roebling's men in the Brooklyn caisson reached their goal.
They hit bedrock at about 46 feet.
But Roebling was struggling to stay at work.
He took a lot of morphine to deal with the pain.
Emily tried to help him.
There's a description of trying to revive him by rubbing him down with whiskey and salt.
Soon in the Manhattan caisson, some workmen too became unwell.
They got to 46 feet, they got to 50 feet, and 60 feet, and 70 feet. And by the time they were getting to that point, people were getting really sick.
Spending a lot of time in this pressurized atmosphere deep below the river caused a condition they called caisson disease.
People believed the atmosphere in the caissons was very strange, this incredibly thick, heavy air. Your fingertips would wrinkle because the blood was kind of driven back from them. The air was too dense to whistle. So people thought that it was the air down there that was the problem. And surely you'd want to get back up to the top as quick as you can. That's what people felt.
But as workmen rushed to the surface at the end of each shift, they were in fact making things much worse.
The nitrogen that's in your body, that's in your blood, if you rise too quickly, it will form bubbles that become trapped in your joints. And this is incredibly painful. It's called colloquially the bends because people would sort of twist up in pain.
In some cases, this led to paralysis and even death. At the time, no one knew why. Roebling himself was in the caissons so often that he developed the symptoms.
He was very worried about his men and how deep the tower would have to go.
His knowledge of geology helped. 78 feet down in the dense, compacted sand, his men hit spurs of boulder that were sharp and thin. Roebling's men noticed that these spurs had not been rounded by water.
The sharpness of these spurs made Washington understand that probably, there had been no movement for at least 100,000 years. So he decided to call a halt to the digging.
There was a risk that this base would be less stable than rock, but Roebling felt confident.
That means that the New York Tower of the Brooklyn Bridge rests on sand.
In the following months, Washington Roebling was in agony with the symptoms of caisson disease.
It damages the tiny, tiny blood vessels that are in your bones and kind of causes them to collapse. And that causes enduring, long-lasting pain, and that cannot be repaired.
Emily tended to him with great care, but after a while, Washington could no longer handle the day-to-day work. The Roeblings couldn't bear to abandon the project. Instead, Emily Roebling took over. She wasn't a trained engineer, but she was highly resourceful.
She became absolutely necessary to the work. She could best be described as a project manager, which is a massive, massive job.
Soon, Washington Roebling stopped attending the construction site at all. He still directed the work from home, but Emily Roebling carried it out.
And she was conveying his instructions, both to his assistant engineers and also to the trustees of the bridge, who were the men, always men, in charge of the money.
Emily Roebling was more than just a messenger. She was quick-thinking and knowledgeable, and often had to make decisions herself.
We have records of manufacturers writing directly to her with specifications for certain kinds of iron fixings that the bridge needed. She clearly, absolutely knew her stuff.
Roebling's eyesight had begun to fail. He could no longer write letters.
All the handwriting of the draft letters and the letters becomes hers. Their handwriting is very different. You can tell the difference. Now, it's still his voice. He has a very distinctive written voice. you can see he's dictating, and then she goes on.
Now that his health was in such a bad way, Roebling could no longer face sucking up to the rich men funding the project. All of that responsibility also fell to Emily.
She was a diplomat. Nobody wanted to deal with him, but they were very happy to deal with her, and she ensured that he wasn't kicked off the bridge.
Though they continued to work together, Emily Roebling was now the person everyone dealt with. 1876. At last, the bridge towers stood at their final height, more than 277 feet above the water. But then, the next challenge began.
It's called the spinning of the cables, although they're not really spun, but their wire is taken back and forth across the river to make the cables in place.
Washington and Emily Roebling used the same method John Roebling had patented some 3 decades before. They coordinated the use of 14,000 miles of galvanized steel wire.
The material for these wires, for the cables, wasn't specified by John Roebling. And it was his son, Washington, who said very plainly that they would be made of steel. Steel was a new material in these days, used in this scale.
The cables formed a web, holding the bridge in place from its towers against the wind and the heavy load of traffic. At last, the form became visible.
Suddenly, the people in New York and Brooklyn, remember, still 2 separate cities, could see that this was indeed going to be a bridge.
The 24th of May, 1883. Opening day for the East River Bridge. It had taken 14 years. Washington Roebling insisted that Emily should ride across the bridge in a carriage.
He wanted her to have the honor of really being the first person to cross this extraordinary bridge.
14 tons of fireworks were let off.
Washington was passionately against the fireworks, and the promenade of the Brooklyn Bridge is made of wood. So he insisted that the fire department come before the fireworks were set off and completely soak the wooden promenade. Safety first, rather than celebration.
A parade followed.
The President of the United States was the largely forgotten Chester A. Arthur, and afterwards there was a big reception at the Roeblings' house. There was a sort of sugar replica of the Brooklyn Bridge made at great expense.
The new bridge was the tallest structure in the Western Hemisphere. It was a testament to the industrial progress of the era, the world's first steel wire suspension bridge. The bridge acted as a catalyst for economic growth and urban expansion between New York and Brooklyn. In 1898, they ceased to be separate cities and were united as boroughs of the city of New York.
The existence of the Brooklyn Bridge had a lot to do with that.
In 1915, the name of the bridge was changed to the one it still bears today, the Brooklyn Bridge. After the bridge was finished, Washington Roebling retired.
He never built anything else. It was his great work.
Emily Roebling travelled the world.
A woman of great privilege who enjoyed her privilege. She did a law course. She wrote an essay for the Albany Law Journal called A Wife's Disabilities, which was an argument for women's suffrage. She went to the coronation of the Tsar. She was presented to Queen Victoria.
While his wife lived it up, Washington Roebling stayed happily and quietly at home. The pair remained very much in love. They joked warmly about each other in letters to their only son, John.
Washington writes of Emily gallivanting all over the world and how she comes home kind of all full of herself and, thinks we're all beneath her. And she will write to John about how grumpy, Washington is about this, that, or the other.
Emily Roebling developed stomach cancer and died, aged just 59, in 1903. Given his own poor health, Washington Roebling had never really expected to be a widower.
But he always kept her picture by his bed.
5 years later, he married again. In the 1920s, he was unexpectedly put back to work. His father's company, John A. Roebling's Sons, had passed down another branch of the family. But the sudden deaths of 2 nephews, one of whom went down on the Titanic, meant he was called back in. By then, he was in his mid-80s.
Every day, he took the trolley car from his house to the mill, and he completely modernized the company. This little old man, he was quite shrunken by this time, and he was always called the Colonel.
He died at the age of 89. He was buried alongside Emily in Cold Spring, New York. Some called the Brooklyn Bridge the 8th wonder of the world.
The Brooklyn Bridge is free to cross in the middle of the night, at dawn, anytime you like. You don't have to go to an art museum. You don't have to see a show on Broadway to have a profound experience of what it's possible for human beings at their best to achieve.
The wire ropes designed by the Roeblings are still a staple of elevator design, the movie industry, and even skyscrapers.
Like a web that holds all the modern world together.
Both Washington and Emily Roebling are remembered as the builders of the bridge.
Washington always felt throughout his life that his course had been directed externally and that he really hadn't ever had a choice in how he lived his life, and that was hard for him. And the way that he found his way through, both by his own resilience and also because of the support that he had from his remarkable wife, offers something to all of us.
In 2021, the Emily Warren Roebling Plaza was opened in Brooklyn Bridge Park.
I recognize in both Washington and Emily Roebling, as individuals and as a pair, people who rose to the occasion. Life will present you with difficulties, and you must decide what to do. There's a wonderful quote from Washington. You can't get out of the work. Life lays on you. It was a life of privilege, but it was also a life of great challenges. And they're heroes because they rose to those challenges, and we can cross the river on their monument every day.